growing over time. So don't be.
Yeah.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay, we're live.
Welcome back, everybody. It is my pleasure now to introduce our first keynote lecture of Maine 2020. It's Dr. Nicole Rust from the University of Pennsylvania. So Dr. Nicole Rust is an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She received a PhD in neuroscience from New York University and trained as a postdoctoral researcher at the MIT. And her research focuses on understanding the neural computations responsible for integrating the perceptual and cognitive components of objects and scenes. And to approach these problems, Nicole works with behavioral and neural data collected as subjects perform visual tasks with computational data analysis and modeling. So perfectly fitting for the scope of Maine at the Montreal AI and Neuroscience meeting, and we're super excited. And I have to say, we've been trying to get Nicole to speak at Maine since 2017, and we're happy that this year it worked out. So without any further ado, I will leave you with Nicole, and the title of her talk today is going to be How We Remember What We've Seen. Thanks, Nicole, for accepting the invitation.
So thank you so much, Kareem. Thanks to the organizers, both for inviting me, as well as for putting together this really fantastic meeting that I'm excited to participate in as a speaker, but also as a participant. So yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about this question, how do we remember what we've seen? And I'm going to be focusing specifically on how we remember the images that we've seen, which I think is a really exciting and perhaps tractable problem. So what inspires my group really at the core to study this question is the remarkable ability that we as humans, as well as non-human primates, have to remember images.
Screen with us right now, because I'm not seeing the...
Oh, you can't see? Oh, no.
No, me neither.
Oh, no. Okay. So I stopped sharing.
Slide share again.
Okay. Can you see now?
Nope, not yet.
Okay.
We'll figure this out.
Well, that's unfortunate. So I'm going to share screen again.
Okay.
Application window, this, share.
Yes.
How about now?
Looks
yes?
good.
No, it goes black afterwards.
Oh, no. Okay, so what do you suggest?
Can you please try exit full screen for, I think you're using Keynote. So just exit full screen for Keynote, and then there's a play drop-down menu from, sorry, are you on full screen?
Not any longer.
Not any longer. So hover over the top of your Mac, and then there should be a play drop-down menu. And then do you see like a play in a window, something like that? Should be like the second from the top.
Nope, I just have play slideshow.
Play slideshow in a window, something like that.
It's not, nope, that doesn't exist.
No? Okay.
Not on my version of Keynote.
Would you like to close the screen share and try it again?
Sure.
Okay, so now if you go to the Keynote and then try to see if there's a play slideshow in window.
So there is not a play slideshow in the window in this version of Keynote.
I see. Okay, then just play as normal and then try to share the entire screen.
Okay, so I will screen share. Now I'll try to share, yes, like you said, my entire screen this time as opposed to the application window. Does that work?
Yes.
Yes, that worked.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We tried it yesterday. It worked. It's not working today. Okay. So yeah, so like I said, the reason we're so interested in visual memory in my group is because we as humans are just really good at visual memory. So for example, we can remember thousands and thousands of images after seeing each only once and each for a few seconds. And what this tells us is that this is an example of visual learning that it happens on single trials and it happens at fast capacity. So it turns out that this behavior is relatively well characterized. It goes back to Lionel Standing's paper called Learning 10,000 Pictures that was published back in 1973. But what we know a little bit less about is the neural mechanisms that support this remarkable behavior. And so this is where my group is hoping to contribute. So we're hoping to complement all of this really fantastic work, some of which we heard about today, that's going on in humans, both in terms of human behavior and human fMRI, with work in the one animal model that to date has been demonstrated to recapitulate some of the most amazing aspects of visual memory for images, and that is the rhesus macaque monkey. And so in rhesus monkeys, what we can do is we can record neural data at exquisite spatial and temporal resolution. We think that's really important for getting at the heart of neural mechanism. We have access to basically any brain structure we want, which we also think is important. And ultimately, we can perform causal perturbation experiments that will allow us to test our theories about memory, the type of experiments you can't perform in humans. So today I'm going to be telling you about what we've been up to over the last handful of years in terms of addressing this question, how we remember what we've seen. But before I dig into our own studies, I just want to introduce a secondary topic that I'll be threading throughout my talk, and this is what I'll refer to as the visual priority code. Okay, so to introduce the priority code, I just want to begin with this equation. It's a very simplified version of the Bellman equation. So we heard a little bit about this earlier. So in reinforcement learning, the way it works is you drive an artificial agent to learn by exploring its environment. And when it has many options that are presented before it that it needs to select among, it will select among those based on their value. And in the most straightforward versions of reinforcement learning, value is computed exclusively based on the amount of reward that the agent associates with that particular state or option. Okay, so both the rewards it might receive immediately as well as integrated rewards across the future. Now, with regard to how this equation relates to a talk on visual memory, some of you might be aware that there are extensions of this type of formulation that also incorporate novelty as an intrinsically valuable experience. The idea here is to embody the agent with curiosity, which mimics the fact that we as humans, as well as all animals across the entire animal kingdom, we're inherently curious. We like to explore things that we haven't seen before. And it's this formulation of value that is integrated across rewards and novelty that's been shown to be more effective than reward alone, at least in some situations. For example, when rewards are sparse or when basically everything is novel to the agent. Now, I want to reassure you, this is not a talk about reinforcement learning or novelty-based reinforcement learning, but instead what I want to focus on is this quantity value that's integrated across rewards and novelty and where it might be reflected in the brain. Now, you've probably seen this quantity associated with structures such as the basal ganglia and the dopaminergic neurons there, or perhaps in prefrontal cortex, such as orbital frontal cortex, and that's true. But what I want to emphasize today is that this quantity, or an approximation of this quantity, is also reflected much earlier in the hierarchy than those structures. It's reflected within the visual system itself, and it's reflected via a coding scheme that I'll refer to as the priority code. It's one that's complementary to the identity representations that are reflected there. So specifically what I'm referring to is that if you look in a high-level visual brain area like infratemporal cortex IT, which has been implicated extensively in supporting object-based representations, what you find are representations of images and objects that are reflected in what I'll call a pattern of spikes coding scheme. So the general idea is that different images evoke different patterns of spikes across the IT population. So some images, like an apple, will evoke a particular pattern because some neurons will be responsive to apples. Other images, like a flower, will evoke a different pattern because different neurons will be responsive to flowers. And in this high-dimensional representational space that a lot of us like to think in, you can plot in an n-dimensional space, where n is the number of units in the population. You can just plot the vigor of the response of unit 1 versus unit 2, and so on. And a particular pattern of spikes, say evoked by an apple, will be a vector positioned in one point in this space, and that vector direction will change when you get a different pattern, say the visually evoked response to a flower. So it's this representation that's received, I think, the majority of the focus of machine learning when it's focused on representations of images and objects and neural networks, such as convolutional neural networks that mimic the brain-like representations. Most of those have focused on this pattern of spikes coding scheme. For example, any analysis that focuses on a representational similarity to compare maybe layers of a network or maybe the brain and what's going on in the network. What's received much less attention and focus is the coding scheme that's complementary to that. And this is the one I'm referring to as the priority code. The priority code refers to, what I'm calling the priority code, refers to simply the overall vigor or the magnitude of the firing rate response. And it turns out that this coding scheme is really interesting. It approximates, for example, this quantity value, which is an integration across reward and novelty. So we know that neurons in IT, in the overall population response, it's modulated by both reward, so stimuli that are associated with reward receive more vigorous responses from IT. It's also modulated by novelty, so images that are novel also produce more vigorous responses. And in both cases, those modulations are thought to be approximately multiplicative, meaning they change the length of these population response vectors without changing the direction that these vectors point. So what we're finding in the priority code in IT is some approximation of this value-like representation. But its priority code in IT is not just modulated by these quantities, it's also modulated by other cognitive variables as well, other things that might be interesting for learning, things like surprise. So if things are surprising or unexpected, you also see more vigorous responses in this brain area. Okay. So I think we know enough about the priority code to know that it's really interesting, but we also don't know much about it. We don't know about it extensively. And today I want to focus on the priority code and its relationship to the topic that I introduced on my very first slide, my title slide, and that is remembering images. And specifically, I'll be focusing on the priority code and its role in image memorability, which is a type of behavioral variation in memory. It simply refers to the fact that we systematically remember some images better than others. And the question is, what is the neural correlate of image memorability in the brain? I'll demonstrate to you that it turns out that there's a coding scheme we didn't know to exist in IT. It's another modulation of the priority code. And it's reflected not only in IT in response to images, but also in deep neural networks that are trained to categorize objects. In part 2 of my talk, I'll focus on the hunt for the memory signal, which refers to the signal that drives that percept that something is familiar to us. And I'll be exploring hypotheses that also relate to modulations of the priority code in IT. And finally, I'll just end with a few final thoughts about the implications of these results on memory, but the priority code in the broader scheme at the interface of neuroscience and AI going forward. Okay, so part 1. Image memorability. So image memorability, like I said, it simply refers to the fact that some images are systematically easier to remember than others. And so here on this slide, taken from Khosla et al., this paper by Khosla et al., I've organized images according to their memorability. So images up in the upper left-hand corner are images that are the most memorable, and as you go to the lower right, images become less memorable. And it turns out that this image memorability variation, which of course any theory or account of visual memory would be able to account for, it turns out that this memorability variation is systematic across different individuals. So the same things that I find memorable and forgettable, you will tend to find memorable and forgettable too. So a significant component of this variation is shared. And what this means is that we can give different images a memorability score. We can quantify memorability per image. So that's what allowed us to, for example, organize these images according to their memorability. And that in turn allows us to ask, what are the correlates of the memorability, both in the brain as well as, for example, in deep neural networks? Okay. So that's what I'll be focusing on today, the question of what differs in the brain in terms of a memorable versus a forgettable image. And in terms of quantifying memorability, so this was introduced by Odd Oliva's lab at MIT. And I should mention that basically everything, that's contemporary about this concept of memorability emerges from one way or another from her group and the beautiful work they've done on this topic. And they introduced nice ways to score memorability in these 2 papers. So this first paper by Isola and colleagues, which was focused on the general class of photographs. And then the second paper by Wilma Bainbridge and colleagues, which was focused on the specific subset of facial photographs. And the way memorability is classified is in the context of a recognition memory task, where subjects look on each trial at a single image and they have to report whether or not they've seen it before. So subjects will see an image and then during a delay period, they'll press a bar if it's a repeat. Now, these experiments are typically performed online to facilitate data collection for large numbers of subjects such that memorability can be scored per image, so the average performance of a large number of subjects, so on the order of 80. So they'll have some repeats that happen after a short delay just to make sure the subjects are paying attention. And then they'll have other repeats that happen after 100 intervening trials and minutes have passed. And those are the ones that are used to score memorability. So this will be, for example, a memory repeat. And so memorability is scored simply as the fraction of subjects of about 80 that remember seeing an image. So these scores range from 0 to 1. 1 corresponds to an image that everyone remembered seeing. 0 is one that the subjects remembered seeing at chance. And if you look across large groups of images, such as the 60,000 images that comprise the dataset LaMem, which is publicly available thanks to Khosla et al., you find a large variation in memorability across different images. So there are indeed some images that nearly all the subjects remember seeing. So those are images with memorability scores near 1. There are other images that less than half of the subjects will remember seeing. So those are images with memorability scores less than 0.5, so say 0.4. So there's lots of variation here to account for, and the mean amount of remembering is about 76%. Crucially, these authors demonstrated that these scores are reliable and predictive, meaning you can measure them in one group of subjects, and they're highly predictive of how well another group of subjects will remember seeing those images. So in terms of asking questions about how the content of images maps onto memorability, I'll just mention in passing that that's a really complicated topic. We know that the mapping of content to memorability scores, it is in fact predictable. So there exists, by Khosla et al., they've introduced a deep neural network that can, with high accuracy, quantify and predict a memorability score. So given an image, it spits out a memorability score, and that's a very good account of how memorable that image will be to humans. But this mapping we also know is counterintuitive. So if you ask naive subjects to predict how memorable different images will be, they're very bad at it. In fact, there's zero correlation between the predicted memorability of images and the actual memorability of images. So memorability is not what we think it is naively. We also know that when we do pin it down, it's highly multifaceted. So for example, we know that images with faces tend to be memorable, images with nature scenes tend to be forgettable, and images presented in atypical ways tend to be more memorable than typical versions of particular, say, images or objects. Okay. So I'm not going to talk more about that mapping of content to memorability, other than to say it's complex and it's multifaceted. And instead, what I'll focus on today is what's going on in the brain and what differs in the brain in terms of the representation of a memorable as compared to a forgettable image. So this is a question that we took on as a collaborative project between my group and the group of all of us at MIT. And it was a really fun collaborative effort. It was a collaboration between all of these postdocs are shown on this slide. So from my group, Vahid Mirpour, Drew Jagel, and Travis Meyer, and from Yalda's group, from Aude's group, Yalda Musinzada. And so we began by enabled with a understanding of where we should look in the brain, and that's high-level visual cortex. So this would be the human analog of monkey IT. And this was based on some really nice work that Wilma Bainbridge had done, where she demonstrated that you can decode images such as faces or other types of content. You can decode that information from human high-level visual cortex. So we were interested in taking that where description and then transforming that into a how description. In terms of the how image memorability might be reflected, we went into this project with two different classes of hypotheses about what the representation of memorability might look like in IT. The first was a pattern of spikes coding scheme, the idea that memorability might be reflected in some way similar to the way identity is reflected. And one example of that might be something like a packing hypothesis, the idea that more memorable images are ones who live in their own part of representational space. They're farther away from all the other images. And that makes them more memorable because when images are transformed from vision into visual memory representations, because that's a noisy process, that might be subject to less interference. That would be an example of a pattern of spikes type of coding scheme. Alternatively, it could be the case that it's reflected in this orthogonal representation, the one I described in my introduction as the priority code. So it could be that memorability is reflected as more vigorous responses to the most memorable images. Now, going into this project, we weren't sure what to expect. Both of these options seemed quite unlikely to us because it was the case that in terms of the pattern and this uniqueness hypothesis, we know that visual memory, although I haven't mentioned it so far in the talk, we know that visual memory is very visually specific. So you can, for example, see thousands and thousands of images, and then presented with two remarkably visually similar images, like the bread in the front versus the back of the bread box shown here, you can, with high accuracy, report which one of those was embedded in that stack of thousands. So this suggests that we're remembering these images with remarkable visual specificity, which suggests that the process of converting vision into visual memory is not subject to a whole lot of interference. At the same time, we also thought that it was unlikely that IT had a coding scheme reflected like this. So not only have representations in IT been studied quite extensively now, but I studied them myself. So as a postdoc, I worked with Jim DiCarlo, and I looked at these image and object representations in IT cortex and how they were reflected, and I looked for coding schemes like this, and I didn't find any evidence that this type of coding scheme existed. Rather, what I found is every natural image evokes the same grand mean firing rate response across the IT population. So we really, didn't understand or have an idea of what would come out of this investigation, but we thought it has to be in there somewhere. It has to be linearly decodable. Let's give it a go. So the answer, turns out, is this one. It is memorability is strongly correlated with the overall magnitude or vigor of the IT population response. And this was a very surprising result to us. Okay. So just to show you the evidence. So the data that we collected was collected from monkeys who were performing a task that was very similar to the task that the humans were performing in order to quantify memorability. So on each trial, monkeys saw a single image, and they were asked to make a behavioral report about whether an image was novel or familiar with an eye movement response to one or two targets. So they would see images as novel, they would be repeated later as familiar. And as monkeys were performing this task, we recorded from populations of neurons at single unit resolution in IT cortex. And so I'll show you the data here just for the novel presentations of these images. So we're asking what differs in the representation of an image that's more memorable versus less memorable the first time you see it. But the results I'm about to tell you, they hold for the familiar presentation as well. What we found is a strong and highly significant correlation between how memorable humans find images, which is also turns out correlated with monkey memorability, and the overall vigor or the magnitude of the IT population response, quantified here as the L2 norm of the population response vector. So you can see each dot here is a single image, and you can see that these two are strongly correlated with one another, so a Pearson correlation of 0.68. So because response magnitude is a pretty not intuitive quantity, I'm going to take 2 points on this plot, and I'm going to convert those magnitudes into firing rate responses. What we find is a highly memorable image evokes an overall grand mean firing rate of 15.5 spikes a second, and that decreases by about 20% for a less memorable image. So this is a pretty big effect, considering we're talking about the overall vigor of the response coming out of IT. Okay. So it's this one. It appears that more memorable images evoke more vigorous responses, and this modulation is on the order of 20%. And this is consistent with the idea that more robust visual representations are then translated into better remembering. And so what this suggests is that there is a priority code that exists in IT that we didn't know about before within the class of natural images. And this priority code is not only there, but actually appears to have behavioral consequences. That's likely to be true, at least for remembering the images that we've seen. And with regard to why we overlooked this coding scheme before, we probably missed it just due to the timescales with which we study vision as compared to visual memory. So when object recognition is investigated, typically when it's investigated as object recognition in a glimpse, because that behavior is inherently very rapid, it's often investigated in a paradigm in which images are flashed in this RSVP sequence, each one for on the order of 100 milliseconds. It turns out that in that RSVP type paradigm, you don't actually remember much of anything. In order to remember the images you've seen, you have to look at them for longer. And so when we study memory, we present the images for longer, so hundreds of milliseconds. And what we found is that these identity representations, while they emerge fast, the memorability representations themselves, they take more time to evolve. And so that's probably the discrepancy between the results we're showing here and why we don't see this in rapidly presented data. Okay. So having discovered this new coding scheme that we didn't know about in IT cortex that seems to be strongly correlated with memorability, We then ask the question, well, what is the origin of this coding scheme? Does this type of phenomena follow from the optimizations required for purely visual processing? By that, I mean object categorization. Or is it the case that you also have to optimize a system to do things beyond seeing? So, for example, remember what it's seeing. And to address this question, we, of course, probed deep convolutional neural networks that were trained to categorize objects, but not trained to, they were not optimized to score memorability, and they certainly couldn't remember anything once they'd been trained for object categorization. And so here I'm referring to CNNs such as AlexNet or VGG16. The results I'm going to show you hold for every CNN that we looked at. I'll show you the results here for VGG16. So the general question here is, if we look at different layers of these convolutional neural networks, which many of you know have been mapped and shown to be good approximations, at least a first approximation, of what's happening at the different stages of the visual system. So different layers map onto different brain areas, such as V1, V2, V4, and IT. The question is, do they do what the brain does? Do we find that certain layers respond more vigorously to some images than others after training to categorize objects? And is it the case that the ones that they respond more vigorously to are the ones that we find most memorable? That's the question. So to summarize what's going on in any one layer, I'm going to recapitulate the analysis that we performed for IT cortex and just characterize what's going on in any one layer by just the Pearson correlation between human memorability scores and the vigor of the response or response magnitude in that layer. Okay, so that's just an R value. And if we look at those R values across the different layers of VGG16, we see they appear to mimic what the brain is doing. So at the earliest stages, we find that correlations between population response magnitude and image memorability are quite small, and they're no stronger for a trained version of the network than they are for a randomly connected network. However, as we ascend the layers and we get to the IT-like stages, what we find is that these correlations strengthen and they become much stronger for trained as compared to randomly initialized versions of the network. And not surprisingly, they tend to drop at the highest stages where you have those categorical neurons that are really, they're granular-like cells that are performing the actual classification. So it looks like these networks, which again, I want to emphasize, they're not explicitly trained to represent image and memorability in any way. Image memorability is an emergent property that's coming out of the highest stages. And what this suggests is that the origin of image memorability actually can be traced all the way back to the optimizations required for visual processing. It's really more of a consequence of vision than it is of memory. Okay. So that was our first finding that speaks to the importance of this priority code that's reflected in IT and the behavioral consequences it has for memory. So now I want to focus on more centrally on questions about this memory signal and questions about how memory works. Okay, so let me just, before I do talk about their studies, just talk about this type of memory and how it differs from some of the other types of memory you've been hearing about in this session. So the type of memory that we're referring to here is the question, have you seen this before, when you present someone an image? And it's often referred to as familiarity or recognition memory. And the way I like to describe it is by evoking this experience I think that all of us have had, where you're walking down the street and you see someone and you remember that they're familiar to you. And sometimes this happens in a really frustrating way in the absence of your ability to recall any details about them. So you have this very strong and isolated percept of familiarity absent any ability to recall the details. So it's that yes or no question, have you seen this before? That's the type of memory I think that we're studying. I think that's how I regard it. And in terms of how this type of memory works, what we know is that it's been linked to the same medial temporal lobe brain areas that other speakers who've been studying other types of memory have been referring to. So after signals leave the visual system, so they travel through V1, V2, V4, and then up into IT, they then go into the medial temporal lobe, where they travel through perirhinal cortex and then ultimately up into the hippocampus. And what we know about this type of memory is it's not one structure in the medial temporal lobe that is thought to support it, but many interacting structures are participating in many different ways. So for example, Perirhinal cortex, the structure that barely anyone ever talks about or has heard of, is the structure that's thought to support the remarkable vast capacity of visual memory. So lesions to this structure are the ones that really ablate the ability to report familiarity at all. But it's not the only structure that's supporting memory. It's also the case that the hippocampus is thought to shape the visual specificity of memory. So for example, patients with lesions to the hippocampus, they perform similar to normal subjects in terms of their ability to report whether or not they've seen images before, as long as those images are very visually distinct from one another. But if they're asked to judge the familiarity of visually similar lures that are similar to the things that they've already seen, that's where they show impairments. So it's not just one structure here that's shaping this behavior, it's multiple interacting structures. It's also the case that we're finding evidence that it's not just a feed-forward hierarchical system. That's not how we should be thinking about the medial temporal lobe, but it's also the case that IT is probably receiving feedback from these higher order brain areas. That's where it's receiving its memory signals. So for example, we know that patients with hippocampal lesions, they have both impaired memory performance and they also have impaired signals that are reflected, memory signals that are reflected in high-level visual cortex as well. Okay, so in terms of what we know that there are multiple interacting brain areas. We know that this is complicated. And the question is, well, how are we going to go about figuring this out? How are we going to figure out how visual memory works in the brain, right? You have this remarkable ability to remember images. What are the neural mechanisms that support it? In terms of the approach that my group is taking, we reason that the bottleneck to going from brain areology, where these things are happening, to a real computational description of how the brain is supporting memory is really to carefully pinpoint the neural activity pattern, or the so-called memory signal, that's driving visual memory behavior. So for us, this is really the key to unlocking that question of how, because once you can pinpoint what that signal is, then the question of how is, how does that signal come to be? But in the absence of a complete description of what that signal is, we really feel like we're at a loss for even thinking about the problem. So this has been the motivation behind our hunt for this visual memory signal. So there's been a hypothesis floating around for quite some time about what that signal might be. And it's a signal that is called repetition suppression. That's reflected not only in high-level visual cortex, IT, but also throughout the medial temporal lobe, so perirhinal cortex and the hippocampus. So repetition suppression is a phenomenon that is not in dispute. So nobody disputes that it exists. Repetition suppression simply refers to the fact that if you take one of these high-level brain areas and you showed a novel image, the population will respond vigorously, and with stimulus repetition, the responses will be decreased. That is repetition suppression. The question on the table here is this the neural activity pattern that's driving behavior? So you're walking down the street, you have that aha moment, you remember that you've seen somebody. Is this the neural activity pattern that's driving you to have that percept ultimately? And there are a lot of reasons to suggest that that might be the case. So the properties of repetition suppression align remarkably well, at least qualitatively, with the properties of behavior. For example, Zhang and Brown reported back in 1998 that repetition suppression lasts an incredibly long time, even after just seeing an image once. So it can last up to 24 hours. We also know from other studies that repetition suppression is highly visually specific, even after seeing very large numbers of images. So if you see repetition suppression for one image, it doesn't transfer to a visually distinct image. You only get repetition suppression for that image when it's repeated. Okay. This also suggests a pretty simple encoding scheme that could pretty easily be decoded in order to read out whether or not something is novel or familiar. In the simplest case, it amounts to a total spike count coding scheme, whereby you can just simply count the number of spikes coming out of a population. If it exceeds some threshold, it's novel. If it's below that threshold, it's familiar. Of course, we don't expect it necessarily to be that simple, but that's just one instantiation of this class of hypotheses. Okay. So the question is, well, is this it, or is it something else? Is repetition suppression really the signal that's driving familiarity behavior? And so we began to ask this question in a quantitative way in a study that we did a few years ago, Travis Meyer and myself, where we asked, is the existence and disappearance of repetition suppression in IT, does it quantitatively align with the rates of remembering and forgetting? That is to say, monkeys, like ourselves, they tend to remember better the things they've seen most recently. And is it the case that the rates at which they forget images are matched to the rates of disappearance of repetition suppression in IT? So we asked this question by having monkeys perform a visual memory task of the type that I showed you a few slides ago, and then mapping these forgetting functions and recording signals from IT as monkeys perform this task and measuring repetition suppression. So we formulated this as a class of cross-validated linear decoding schemes of this repetition suppression class. And we found that yes, indeed, instantiations of repetition suppressions, I'll call them repetition suppression prime, were in fact well matched to the behavior, both in terms of the choice function, so these forgetting functions, and they could also explain monkeys' reaction time patterns. And there was a remarkable alignment there between those two. And the instantiation that we found of repetition suppression, what I'm calling repetition suppression prime, it could be formulated in a few different ways. So one was just a simple optimized linear readout. So this is a linear readout where you weight every neuron proportional to the amount of familiarity information it carries. So this is just a Fisher linear discriminant. We could also find a nice mapping if we simply counted the total number of spikes, but not across the entire IT population, but rather the top 50% of most sensitive familiarity neurons. Both of those decoding schemes produced nice predictions, nice alignments between what was happening in IT and these behavioral functions. So that suggested to us that, yeah, repetition suppression, it might be on the right track. There's non-trivial evidence at this point that this, in fact, is the visual memory signal. At the same time, there was something that always really bothered me about this hypothesis. There was a big elephant in the room here. And this was highlighted on the very first slide I showed you in this talk. And that is the priority code of IT, the overall vigor of the response in IT. It's modulated not only by familiarity, but all sorts of other stuff. Reward, surprise, stimulus-evoked variables such as contrast, the contrast of an image, and also what I presented in the first part of my talk, memorability. And with regard to memorability, it turns out that that modulation goes in the wrong direction to have a nice mapping onto the behavior. So just very briefly, what I demonstrated is that the most memorable images evoke the most vigorous responses out of IT cortex. But this hypothesis says for an image to be very memorable, it should evoke a very low firing rate out of IT cortex, right? And so it turns out that those two are not quantitatively aligned. So the question is, well, how would this type of encoding scheme for memory, how would it disambiguate familiarity from other variables that modulate the priority code? So to investigate this question, we designed a study where we modulated not only familiarity, but also the overall vigor of the population response by a stimulus-evoked variable, image contrast. This was prior to our days where we were exploring image memorability. And so we're going to ask the question, presumably, we, as humans, and also monkeys, we don't confuse changes in familiarity with changes in contrast. Does IT confuse those, or does it not? Can we reconcile this big elephant in the room? So the study that I'm about to tell you about is a work led by Vahid Mirpur from the lab, who's a postdoc, with also contributions by Travis Meyer, and this is a collaboration with Eros Simoncelli at NYU. And so monkeys were performing a variant of the task in which, again, they see one image per trial, and they have to report whether that image is novel or familiar by making an eye movement response to one of two targets on the screen. But now the images are presented in grayscale, and they're presented either at high contrast or low contrast. And sometimes we'll swap the contrast across the novel and the familiar presentations. And so monkeys are trained to report familiarity invariant to contrast. So this image, which was viewed earlier as at high contrast, is familiar despite its changing contrast. And in this experiment, we have 6 different behavioral conditions. So images can either be presented as novel at high contrast or low contrast. The contrast reduction here is 50%. Or they can be presented as familiar, either at the same contrast, so high contrast repeated at high, low repeated at low, or we swap the contrast, high-low or low-high. And what we found is that indeed the monkeys did not confuse contrast with familiarity. So here I'm showing you in the bottom plot, percent chose familiar as a function of these 6 different behavioral conditions. The first 4 are the familiar conditions, so where monkeys reported familiarity at a high rate, so familiar images are familiar. And the second 2, the novel conditions, so monkeys reported that novel images were familiar at a low rate. Okay, so that's good. So they're doing the task overall. And on the top 2 subplots, I'm showing you the benchmarks for, on the left, contrast confusion. So that's a pattern you expect if the monkeys are systematically confusing contrast and familiarity, and on the right, perfect contrast invariance. And you can see that the monkeys did not systematically confuse contrast and familiarity. For example, if we take the HH and LL conditions, the red and dark cyan dots there, you see that monkeys reported that familiar images at either high or low contrast were familiar at the same rate. Okay, so the monkeys are not systematically confusing contrast and familiarity. And the question is, well, what happens if you apply the same decoding schemes that we found to be successful in the absence of contrast challenges? So this class of repetition suppression decoders, what happens if we try to map now the IT neural responses onto behavior using those same decoders? And we find that those do not work. It's the case that even a weighted linear readout systematically confuses contrast and familiarity. So this is a Fisher linear discriminant, again, optimizing every neuron for the amount of familiarity information it carries. So we find that what IT is doing, somewhat unsurprisingly, is it's modulated by both familiarity and contrast, and even a weighted linear decoder can't resolve those confusions. Okay. So what this suggests is that IT repetition suppression is not the signal that drives monkeys' behavioral reports of familiarity. And so if it's not that signal, then the question is, well, what is it? So one alternative hypothesis is that we have the right signal, but the wrong brain area. So maybe we just have to go to one of those other MTL structures like perirhinal cortex or the hippocampus, and there we're gonna find the signal that drives the behavior. And of course, we don't know the answer without doing the experiment, but I think that that explanation is going to be unlikely because it's also the case that those other brain areas are also modulated by priority code factors, reward, and so maybe they'll be less modulated by contrast, but the same problem in general will still apply. An alternative to that hypothesis is that we have the right brain area, but the wrong signal. And I have to say there is at this point pretty remarkable evidence that their repetition suppression does account for the behavior quantitatively, although not in the presence of contrast challenges. So this led us to the hypothesis that what the brain is doing is something repetition suppression like, but it's not doing an absolute total spike count coding scheme. Rather, what it's doing is it's doing some sort of reference readout where it's correcting for the overall vigor of the stimulus evoked response. So it's using a reference. If you're looking at a low contrast image, it's using that as a reference. If you're looking at a high contrast image, it's using a different reference. And so it's correcting for those sensory evoked modulations and then measuring reduction in the responses from there. And this hypothesis referred to as sensory reference suppression. Okay, so that's all fine and good, right? You can hypothesize anything you want. What we were surprised to determine was that you can actually think about the mapping in IT cortex as a linear decoder that's doing exactly this. Okay, that is to say, there is a linear decoder in IT. It's a nice account of the mapping from the IT neural responses to behavior. And it behaves exactly like this by correcting repetition suppression for the overall changes in firing rate due to contrast. So let me just describe to you how this works. Okay. So what I'm showing you here on this slide is simply information. It's an elaboration of what I've already shown you. On the upper left, we have the misalignment of the monkey's behavioral patterns in dots and the mapping of a repetition suppression, in this case, a total spike count decoder in the bars. In the central plot, I have this geometric depiction, but now I'm no longer showing you a cartoon. This is a contours from a two-dimensional histogram computed from actual data. The dimensions are no longer the responses of individual units, but 2 dimensions in this high dimensional space. And this plane has been configured such that the total spike count coding scheme falls along the diagonal indicated by that arrow there. And in the dashed line, we have the threshold that differentiates novel from familiar responses once you project onto that linear decoder. And so you can see there that that dotted line separates, in general, the grays, which correspond to the novel images, from the reds and the cyans, which correspond to the familiar presentations. And if you project onto that axis, you get the plot on the upper right, the spikes projection. Okay, so this simply recapitulates the idea that IT cortex is modulated by both familiarity and by contrast, and that's why you see dispersion within the class of novel and familiar images once you project onto the total spike count coding scheme. Now, sensory reference suppression is instantiated by estimating the amount of contrast modulation and correcting for it. And so we found the contrast decoder as just the optimized weighted linear decoder for contrast. And we found that it fell along this plane, not orthogonal, but far away, so 70 degrees away from the total spike count coding scheme. So sensory reference suppression amounts to taking the total spike counts coding scheme and orthogonalizing to information about contrast, so pushing it 20 degrees that way. And you can see that that is successful at minimizing contrast modulation within the class of novel and familiar images. And this sensory reference suppression hypothesis produces a much better account of the behavior than does repetition suppression. So you can see that here. So the bars are the, again, the IT decoded prediction of behavior, and the circles are the actual behavioral patterns. And we can quantify the degree of alignment between the neural predictions and the actual behavior with this quantity PQ, which I'm referring to as prediction quality. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is a perfect prediction, 0 is the worst case given the methods that we're using. And you can see that the RS decoder has a PQ of 0.4, and that increases to 0.9 when you implement SRS. Okay. So what we can conclude from this is that the SRS linear decoder that collects overall firing rate for changes in image contrast, it's a much better account of behavior than is this repetition suppression description, okay, under the challenge of contrast modulation. And in principle, this disambiguation scheme should work not just for contrast, but other variables that are encoded in the priority code, this magnitude variation as well. So memorability, surprise, reward. And that's what I find very attractive about this type of coding scheme. More broadly, it suggests that the brain might be able to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that it can encode all of these different priority variables into one total spike count coding scheme. And at the same time, it can differentiate those, because you can imagine it would want to do that too. It would both want to have this global signal that tells higher order brain areas there's something important here, either for learning or something that you should pay attention to. But at the same time, it can disambiguate and distinguish whether or not changes in firing rate were due to changes in reward or changes in familiarity or changes in surprise, etc. Okay, so that's sensory reference suppression. Okay, so part one, we find that this priority code in IT is modulated by the class of natural images. It's just natural variation within the class of images, and that can account for variation in visual memory behavior, one that's called image memorability. Part two, we describe a way that the memory signal can be decoded from IT cortex despite variation of that type and variation in other variables that contribute to the priority code. So I'd just like to end by sharing a few final thoughts about the implications that this work might have and the implications of the priority code at large, the existence of the priority code might have going forward for neuroscience and AI. And so in general, I just want to re-emphasize from my first slide that I think that the priority code at higher stages of visual processing has been a largely underappreciated coding scheme, both in neuroscience, so we overlooked its existence within the class of natural images, but also by machine learning, because machine learning at large in its investigations of object representations have largely focused on this pattern of spikes coding scheme, and sensibly so. I just want to reiterate that there's stuff going on along this axis too. For example, we know that in machines, there's priority code, surprisingly, it emerges. And it emerges in CNNs, and it predicts an important type of behavior, so variation in our ability to remember the images that we've seen. So going forward, I think we can leverage this understanding to understand more deeply what the visual system is doing and what deep neural networks are doing. We can ask the question, why does priority coding emerge? Presumably, it has something to do with an interaction between the statistics of the natural world and what these networks are optimized to do, categorize object identity. But we don't have a rigorous theoretical understanding of how priority coding emerges from that optimization scheme. For example, anecdotally, we know that atypical images tend to be the most memorable. We also know that atypicality tends to evoke more vigorous responses from a deep convolutional neural network. But what is the relationship between atypicality and optimization and the statistics of the natural world and so on? That's the type of understanding that I think we can both define rigorously, but as well as intuitively to come up with descriptions of how the brain works. In a complementary way, I think we know that in brains, priority coding in IT is likely to reflect a quantity that's really useful for learning. It's some approximation of value. So it's reflecting a combination and integration of novelty and reward and surprise. And the question is, why does the brain do it that way? Why are these cognitive variables reflected in IT cortex? And in terms of a machine learning perspective, what type of optimization can recapitulate this? In the same way that you optimize a system to recognize objects and a priority code emerges that then drives memorability, what is it you have to optimize the system for in order to see these properties emerge, these value-based representations that combine across novelty and reward and surprise and so on? Understanding that can give us a much deeper insight into what the brain is doing, as a whole. Okay, so I'll just end with my speculation there. And I'll just summarize what I've presented in my talk. So I began by asking the question, why is it that there are some images are better remembered than others? So what drives this systematic memorability behavioral variation that we see? What we found is that more memorable images evoke larger magnitude responses from high-level visual cortex, so from monkey IT. And this is also recapitulated in convolutional neural networks that are trained for object categorization. In the second part of my talk, I described our hunt for the neural signal that drives or aligns with visual memory behavior, particularly in the face of these different modulations in the priority code. And what we found is that when you challenge the hypotheses with this type of variation, repetition suppression does not provide a good account, this classic hypothesis, but you can explain the mapping of IT neural responses to behavior using a sensory referenced scheme, so an elaboration of that idea. And finally, I asked the question, what are the implications of these results for future AI and future neuroscience? I just want to end with the emphasis that they support the existence of a priority code in IT that has thus far been underappreciated but may be useful going forward. Okay, so finally, I will just thank our funding sources, and I am happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole. That was wonderful. Absolutely fascinating data and fascinating results. And you have the clapping.
Thanks.
So we do have maybe a few minutes for questions, but the good thing is that because we have a panel discussion straight afterwards, we'll be able to drift right into the panel discussions, and some of these questions can also bleed into that. So
okay. Yeah, that's great.
Just gonna take a look at some of maybe the top upvoted questions. There are really a lot of questions, and the first one I'm going to read is by Shihab. If we synthesize images that maximize response magnitude in IT, do we get highly memorable images?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I know that Oates Group has been working on a GAN that actually maximizes in their network memorability. And so we've talked about trying to do those experiments experimentally. I know that behaviorally, I will say that behaviorally they did test So the goal was to maximize memorability, and they found behaviorally memorability was in fact maximized. But in terms of what's going on in the brain, we don't know yet. And I think, yeah, that's the next generation of experiments for sure.
Awesome. Second question, in dreams, we can have the sensation of, this is a question by Emily Coffey. So in dreams, we can have the sensation of familiarity, recognition that seems dissociated with the memory. So for example, you know it's your grandma's house, but it doesn't look like her actual house. So does that suggest separability of functions?
Separability of functions, meaning you can have an experience of familiarity that's abstracted away from the thing that was actually attached to. And you're dreaming, so all sorts of trippy things going to happen. I don't know. I'm going to punt on that. I think it's a great question for the panel, and it's a great question. But yeah, I don't know what that means. Yeah.
So I'll go to the next question. Do humans memorize visual information with low-level details, or they create abstract representations about some concepts and assign labels to those concepts?
Yeah, so both. So definitely there are, I think, the degree to which we remember images with such remarkable visual detail suggests, and we also know that memorability, for example, it can be modulated by some of these lower level factors to some degree. But yeah, there are definitely conceptual influences on memory as well. And I think that speaks to, the question is, when we study memorability and memory in monkeys, what are we studying? And I think of what we're studying perhaps might not be so much of that conceptual stuff, but rather the perceptual stuff. So we're constantly checking ourselves to say, the thing that we're studying right now, is this a thing that's reflected in humans, or do humans do this differently? And I find it really remarkable, I didn't present that evidence today, that in terms of this memorability variation, we all tend to find the same images memorable and forgettable across cultures and that sort of thing. But remarkably, what monkeys find memorable and forgettable is correlated with what we find memorable and forgettable. And that's particularly remarkable given that the monkeys are growing up in such a different environment, right? So these are laboratory animals. They don't see fire trucks and cars and stuff every day. So yeah, I think there are both components that are contributing, but I think that what we're studying, or what we've studied so far, is largely that first. It's not a lower level thing. It's the thing that emerges in the deep nets at those highest stages, right? The object categorization layers. It's something mid-level, high level, but not quite conceptual.
Right. As I said, there are many questions. I'll just one more, and then we'll close this session. A question by Mohammed Abdelhaq. Are we talking about memorability in terms of intrinsic properties of the image itself that makes it more memorable, or are we discussing topics like novelty and attention, which could be our subject and situation dependent? I think you've already mentioned this in your talk, but maybe you can elaborate on this. So basically the low-level information from the images making them actually memorable compared to the internal experience.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot wrapped up in this question, and which makes it a little bit hard to answer. Certainly, the monkeys are performing a task, and they know that their job is to remember images, and that's also the case in the humans. But certainly, there's also this kind of automatic component to this. So you'll still find that people are very good at remembering images, even if they're performing some other task and they're not aware that they're supposed to remember them. It's not to say that memory is not modulated by attention and other factors. And so I think that that is a very complex question. It's multifaceted. There are components that can be attributed to attention. There are high-level factors, there are low-level factors. There's lots of stuff going on there, and I think it's incompletely understood. Yeah. So we're talking right now about the monkeys are, to directly answer your question, the monkeys know that they're performing a task. The humans know that they're performing a memory task, and that's what we're talking about. So we can't dissociate from our data those different factors. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you once again. This was absolutely fascinating. We're going to have, luckily for us, more of this because we'll be now moving into the panel session. And to do that, we'll have to close this session. And then in a few minutes, when all the speakers are ready, they will all come on stage with the panel. And we'll have Blake Richards that's going to be moderating that panel discussion. So very much looking forward to this. Thanks once again, Nicole.
Thanks, everyone. See you in a moment.
Thank you.